Hey folks, it's Ardwulf. Welcome. We're going to do a flip through today, a physical product that has just arrived and which I have been very excited about for quite a while since I heard about it for the very first time, and who the nice folks at Open-Ended Games were kind enough to send me. This is Against the Darkmaster, the classic game of fantasy adventures. This is the core rulebook. We also have, and we're going to take a brief look at the GM's pack thing here. So we'll get to that in a bit. In the meantime, Against the Darkmaster here is a massive tome of fantasy adventure. Now, what do we mean by the classic game of fantasy adventure? Well, I spent a lot of the 90s with my main RPG being a game called Rolemaster from Iron Crown Enterprises. And related to Rolemaster was another game, the old Middle-earth role-playing game, which had some tonal disconnects with the Middle-earth source material because of the mechanics, which were derived from Rolemaster, but otherwise was a very loving treatment of the Middle-earth subject. Now, this is not a Middle-earth RPG. Against the Darkmaster is not. And it appeared to me when I first heard about it as though this was a type of retro clone. Having looked at this in PDF for a while now, I don't think it actually does qualify as a retro clone of Rolemaster or MERP. It is instead a new take on similar ideas. I am very favorable. This is literally the first time I'll be opening the physical book, but based on the PDF, I'm reasonably interested in it, and you're definitely going to see more video material on Against the Darkmaster from me. The Rolemaster books that I played back in the day had beautiful Angus McBride covers, and this to me is definitely reminiscent of that. It's definitely a Lord of the Rings-esque party here with a halfling and a dwarf and an elf and a rugged-looking human and somebody of indeterminate species back here, and a sorceress of some kind, and a dark tower. The Darkmaster is an actual thing in the game. What the game system is designed to do, in addition to using a lot of the same concepts as Rolemaster and MERP, it's designed to emulate a type of high fantasy story that runs from Tolkien through Robert Jordan through Brandon Sanderson, where a party of brave heroes are up against an evil dark power, okay? And that dark power in the game is called the Darkmaster. The game gives you guidelines on how to construct your campaign's Darkmaster, and at no point is the Darkmaster like a bestiary entry that you have to go and fight. Instead, you have to find a way to destroy the Darkmaster, much as the Council of Elrond did, where the ring had to be thrown into the fire to destroy Sauron. So it's actually a really neat plot element. Now, the book itself, as you can see, is enormous. I don't even remember what the page count is, but it's well over 500 pages. 564 pages, not counting the end leaves. And I don't know about the binding yet. We're going to find out. It cracks as soon as I open it. So I don't have the ability to do like a complete flip through this thing just because the book is so big, but we're going to flip through it very briefly, and then we'll get into individual aspects of the game in future videos. So the logo is a little bit off center on the cover, and I don't know if that is a by design thing, but it was like the first thing I noticed, to be completely honest. Very square binding, by the way. And at a glance, is this a sewn binding? It looks like it might be. And if it is, I mean, a book this big almost has to have a sewn binding, or it is going to literally explode the first time that you open it. So let's hope that it does. And it will reveal itself in due time if it's not. So table of contents, big table of contents. And this is a complete in one book type of thing. There is no like optional yet mandatory additional book. And I don't know, maybe we'll find out and do some video on this. I don't know that what the long-term support plan for Against the Darkmaster is. So I don't know what else might be in the pipeline. There is also, I'll point out, an adventure in the back, a decent-sized adventure at that. And then there's an appendix. Now, Rolemaster veterans will know that there are attack tables, okay? And I'm gonna fight this to my last breath because everybody makes an assumption. A lot of people make an assumption without ever having played Rolemaster that Rolemaster is very complicated because there are a lot of tables. That's actually not the case and has never been the case. Depending on the edition of Rolemaster we're talking about, some of those editions, like the second edition, for example, are really pretty simple because there's tons of tables, but the tables are all the same type of table. So you have a table for a broadsword, you have a table for a hand axe. If you're using a hand axe, use the hand axe table. If you're using a broadsword, use the broadsword table. You don't need the entire book of tables handy because you only have a broadsword and maybe a dagger and a short bow. You need those tables and then their associated critical tables. Combat resolution is typically one roll combat resolution with a second roll if you do a critical. So it's a pretty tight system and plays very quickly as long as everyone knows what they're doing and has the appropriate tables handy. That's why this extra book of the tables is so handy because you need like a copy of these things. I would typically photocopy my specific attack tables and keep them with my character sheet. So in a binder typically. All right, so there was a Kickstarter for this, which I did not get in on just because it just wasn't. I mean, I wanted to, and it just didn't happen for me for a variety of reasons. Does it look like there's a tiny print error up there where maybe this is like a person's ID or something, and that's not an error. But here are the Kickstarter backers at various levels. The art is, I think, very much a sort of 90s inspired fantasy RPG art. Much like one might find in the AD&D books at the time. But for all that, it's pretty good. So, and we'll see some of my favorite art actually is in the character section. So this is the introductory section, and this talks about the Darkmaster. The Darkmaster is a blanket term. That's not his name. That's just the game's name for that plot element of your campaign. And as part of setting up the campaign, you will develop who the Darkmaster is. And then certain types of magic, for example, like certain results of magic might call the Darkmaster's attention to your group, and the Darkmaster will then send enemies to go and kill you. It's actually quite neat. It is very much in keeping with Tolkien and some other inspirations. And there's a list of the inspirations right here. We have a lot here, actually, including Andrzej Sapkowski's. This is The Witcher, the author of The Witcher, by the way. So a couple of those books, the Brandon Sanderson stuff, David Eddings' Belgariad, which I've read which is not like great literature, but I've read it several times nevertheless. David Gemmel's Draenei series, I've read at least one of those. E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros, that's an old book from the 40s or 50s, or maybe even the 30s, and very difficult to read nowadays. But it's considered a classic of the fantasy genre. Of course, you have George R.R. Martin. I don't really feel like that thematically fits with the thematic foundation of the game, but it's not a complete misfit either. I mean, you do, after all, have a Dark Lord that you had to go find a way to kill in the Night King. So, there's, of course, Tolkien, Joe Abercrombie, Catherine Curl, Lloyd Alexander's Prydain series, the Weiss and Hickman Dragonlance Chronicles, which kind of fits. Mercedes Lackey, which I've never read anything of. Paul Anderson's The Broken Sword, which is a great book that I highly recommend. And very much in keeping with the actual Norse sagas. Raymond Feist's Rift War series, which is a fun series. Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, which was really cool before it bloated. This turned into a short digression on what I think of all these book series, most of which I have read. Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy, which I have not. The Thomas Covenant series, also very difficult to take, in my opinion. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Todd Williams. I didn't finish that. Terry Brooks's Sword of Shannara, very much not great books, but very much in keeping with the thematic foundations of the material, and Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea series, which very much is, and which is brilliant, and you should read. And there's a bunch of movies listed here, too, including like The Black Cauldron, the animated The Black Cauldron that Disney did years ago. That's from the Lloyd Alexander Prydain series. Both versions of Lord of the Rings. Well, two of the three versions of Lord of the Rings, the Ralph Bakshi version and the Peter Jackson version. They don't mention the Rankin Bass animated version here. And, of course, The Princess Bride, because everybody loves it. Willow, because a lot of people like that. Princess Mononoke, which is an interesting addition. Labyrinth, Ladyhawke, Legend. And then, actually, they list musical sources of inspiration as well, which are mostly heavy metal bands, which is fantastic. And, you know, some of the music is fantastic, too. But you could cross all the names off and just leave Dio, and you would be set. So, and then we have some RPGs here, which include D&D, obviously, various editions of D&D. The Pendragon RPG from Greg Stafford, currently being published by Chaosium again. That is a brilliant game. Middle-earth role-playing. Doesn't list Rolemaster, and I think the foundations of the game are closer to MERP than they are to Rolemaster for various reasons, but it certainly brings in some of the additional stuff that Rolemaster introduced as well. The One Ring role-playing game, which is the subject of that new Kickstarter, which was very successful, which ended relatively recently. Zweihander, which is a retro clone, as far as I can tell, of Warhammer Fantasy. The Fellowship Gathers is pretty much character creation. So, the basics, here's your introduction to the mechanics. Now, one of the key things in Rolemaster, and one of the key things here, and in fact, the inspiration for the name of the publisher, is the open-ended percentile roll. And how this works is, if you roll a percentile dice, you get what you get, right? If you get a 65, you get a 65. But if you roll a 96 or more, the roll is open-ended high, and you roll again and add that number, that new number, to the original result. If you roll 5 or less, the roll is open-ended low, and you roll again and subtract that number from the original result. So it is a 1 to 100 range, but you might end up with a roll that is vastly more, because I've seen people open end 3 times. You can open end multiple times. You can open end twice, or 3 times or whatever, as long as you keep rolling high. And this talks about that. So this explains all that. There are also D10 and D5 rolls. D5 is very awkward. I have looked through, because I've had the PDF for a while now, for about 2 months. I have looked through this, and I don't recall seeing the use of 5-sided dice. So if it's a one-off obscure little thing in the corner somewhere, I don't mind it so much. As a cornerstone roll, because it's hard to find D5s, I do not approve. But if it's an oddity that appears once, I don't care too much. So that's that. So character creation. I am planning at this time to do a character creation video for Against the Darkmaster. So if you would like to see that, please mention it in the comments below. We have stats, the much simpler loadout of stats than Rolemaster had. We have 6 stats: Brawn, Swiftness, Fortitude, Wits, Wisdom, and Bearing. I am going to complain because there is two stats that start with the letter B and 2 stats that start with the letter W, and they are easy to conflate when you are looking at the abbreviations for that reason. That's why when I do this, meaning fantasy RPG design, I always make sure that all of the stat names are such that they can have distinctive abbreviations. And that was not done here. That may be because the designers were not native English speakers. I don't know. Nevertheless, not a big problem, but it's a thing I noticed. So Rolemaster and MERP have percentile-based stats, and then the stat score itself gives you a modifier, right? Which is very similar to the way current versions of D&D do it. You have a score, and then you have a modifier that depends on the score. In Against the Darkmaster, you roll percentile to determine your score, which is the modifier. So you're only rolling percentile once. You're never writing the percentile roll down. You're only writing the stat value down, and then the stat value is what you use henceforth, which makes a lot of sense, and in fact is a nice way to streamline the original MERP and Rolemaster method, where you had a percentile score, but you never touched that percentile score unless it went up or down. After character creation, you never used it mechanically for anything. There's also a point buy system, which is, and also an array system. Now, this isn't really arrays. This is just examples. But there's a point buy system if you just object to random stats. I personally don't object to random stats, but some people do. You have the races or species or peoples called kins. There are a whole bunch, and they're pretty much the typical ones that you would expect from a Tolkien-inspired. Now, it's like I said, it's not a Tolkien RPG, but it is most closely inspired by Tolkien. And so the races more or less fit with that. And just as you find in Tolkien, there are different like subspecies and D&D too, but that's where D&D got this. And you have stat modifiers, very traditional stat modifiers for the races. And then you have background options, which we'll hopefully get to. We're just going to buzz through. I'm trying not to talk too much about the mechanics stuff, because we'll do that later in another video. I just want to give you a sense of the game. So we have man and high man, very much in keeping with Tolkien. And the illustrations are pretty good. We have the dwarf. We have the halfling. We have the half-elf. The silver elf. The dusk elf. The star elf, the Noldor. The wild folk, who are kind of Dunlendings, maybe, or the Woodwoses, more like the Woodwoses, I think. And we have orcs, we have half-orcs, and we have stone trolls, and we have furbolgs, who are sort of giant people. And I think that the furbolgs may have been this feels like it doesn't fit enough that it must have been a stretch goal in the Kickstarter. That's what it feels like to me. But you could always pick and choose which races you like, too. All right, so when you've chosen a race, after that you pick a culture. And while there are suggested cultures for each of the races, you're not technically restricted. So the cultures then, and you can roll them randomly. You can roll kin and culture randomly on this table if you want, but you're not required to. And then the culture gives you some skills, some additional skills, which are on here. And here's the entire list of skills, by the way. One of the virtues of second edition Rolemaster is the super tight skill list, but that's also a problem because it's just a little too tight. It could use 3 to 5 additional skills. And the skill selection here and against the Darkmaster, I think, addresses all of the holes in the Rolemaster second edition skill list, without blowing it up to be hundreds and hundreds of skills like Rolemaster Standard System does. If I someday do a video about Rolemaster, I will talk about the different editions and how Rolemaster Standard System pretty much bloated the whole thing into oblivion. So culture gives you some equipment as well, and then we have descriptions of all those and quite nice illustrations. I particularly like this guy with the spear. One of the interesting things about the root of the system is that any weapon is pretty much viable. Even daggers, if you want to use daggers, the woad. So you can be the wild folk woad, which is just a super primitive character. Wield, the marauding. So the marauding culture is more for NPCs and bad guys. And then you choose a vocation, and there are 6 vocations. If you are thinking character class, you are pretty much correct. But as is the case with Rolemaster and MERP, the character class or vocation here does not indicate your character's actual abilities. Those are indicated by skills. And what the class does is determine what the skill costs are. So against the Darkmaster here, you basically have favored and not favored skill categories, and the favored categories, the skills are cheaper, and you get points. And if it's a favored category, the skills cost 1 apiece, and if it's a not favored, they cost 2 apiece, and that's pretty much it. I think it's that simple. The vocations are the warrior, and again, I really do like the illustrations here. They are old school, without looking primitive and amateurish, as many of the OSR products have art that I would classify as amateurish. Not all of them by any means. Warrior, rogue, wizard, animist. And I would categorize this as at least OSR adjacent, the champion and the dabbler. And it's definitely more of interest to me than a lot of OSR material. That's another thing I could do a video on. I like a lot of what has come out of the OSR, and I dislike some of the things about the OSR strongly enough that I don't wish to really dwell on it or be associated with it. So here's the descriptions of the skills. They're thorough, but they're not so... so here's the perception skill, right? And you have a little, quarter page on the perception skill. So you're not getting so much detail in this giant pile of modifiers or anything like that. You just have the difficulty classes, and the Game Master can adjudicate that however they like. And I like that. In some editions of D&D, there's pages and pages and pages of modifiers for use on the different skills. And it's hard to keep track of that stuff. There's not a lot of fixed modifiers in this game. There's a few for combat, and that's pretty much it. Everything else just works off a basic table of difficulties. There are also some additional skills called specialty skills, which are more optional. It says they're completely optional. But I think you would want to use them, but because they do specialized things, like intimidation is one of them. I'm not sure how specialized that is. Assassination is kind of what it sounds like. It's a special. It's like the ambush skill from Rolemaster. A lot of these, in fact, are dual weapons is one of these. Cooking. Some of these are like secondary skill type skills, like cooking. Any character can learn any of these, and vocations with no vocational spell lores can develop specialty skills using DPs. Those are development points from the category the skill belongs to, gaining 2 ranks in the skill for each development point spent. So they're easy to buy if you're a character with no vocational spell lores. And I think there is an optional Sage vocation too somewhere in the book, which I would totally use as available to PCs, although it's hard to play as a PC. And then you have background options. So one of the balancing mechanisms for characters is these background option points that you get. So the powerful races like elves don't get as many of these background options, where the weak races like humans and halflings get a relatively large number of these background points. And you can select from this menu of different little special abilities and little heirloom items and things like that. And it's really quite nice. And then it talks about finishing touches, but then you have one other item after finishing touches, which is, I think, a bit of a misstep to put this before or after finishing touches. Passions and drive. This is a mechanic that we've seen in a lot of newfangled story games. But I think the direct inspiration here is actually the passions from Pendragon and the goals, or whatever they're called, from Burning Wheel. And I think it looks pretty neat. You basically have 3 passions. You have a nature, an allegiance, and a motivation. And then when you can invoke those passions in play to say, hey, my allegiance is to, King Brand, and King Brand is being threatened right now. So I will invoke that passion, that allegiance, to get this concrete bonus. And then that is one of the means in which, a way I don't want you to explain fully right now, you actually progress the character as well. And you can imagine how that works. Nature, allegiance, and motivation, right? The motivation is the character's goal. The nature is just kind of the character's inner nature. And it actually gives you a kind of adorable little way to, if you can't come up with a passion, you go listen to metal songs and you get your passions from inspired by the metal songs. A lot of Dio on here, as you can imagine, but we also have Iron Maiden, Amon Amarth, Motorhead, Blind Guardian, which is another favorite of mine, Manowar, which is the band where everybody plays bass guitar. So that's pretty cute. And then there's Drive, which is like a points pool that you can use. And then when you spend the points, you get the character progression item, which we'll get to that in a later video in detail. There's also a heroic path, which is the sort of it's a level-based system, but levels get capped at a relatively low level 10. And then after that, the heroic path is the means by which the character progresses. Character advancement. So there's a nice blend here of old school stuff inspired by Rolemaster, in some cases D&D, by Tolkien, by 90s fantasy, with a sprinkling of new mechanics that feel organic to the system without feeling like, hey, this is just tacked in and doesn't really make any sense. The drives is also a potentially way around a classic Rolemaster problem of excessive lethality, that the combat system is so deadly that it's very easy for player characters to just randomly get killed because, the enemy rolled a 175. That's I think harder to have happen in this system. One, because the way the tables are structured, which again will be beyond the scope of this video, but maybe we'll look at it in the future. And 2, by the drive points pool that you can use to mitigate that. And this is the section on character advancement. And we are like 100 pages into this 600-page book so far. We have character sheets. There's pretty nice character sheets. And it's a couple sample characters here. And one of the things I like is that I've seen this before, of course, is a pointer on the sample character sheet of where in the rules you go find this stuff. That's pretty nice. Also, there's another cool thing in the experience system where you get experience points, but then your campaign gets to determine a couple of additional sources of experience points off a menu, and that's where you write this stuff down, and that's actually pretty cool too. Resolving actions. Percentile roll. Here's your difficulty classes, and here are the numbers that you're trying to get for partial success, success, or outstanding success, which are the 3 levels of success. And then you have sort of basic resolution here. 175 or more is outstanding success, and you're going to have a skill rating in whatever you're trying to do, which might be 10 or 20, it might be 90 or 120. And remember, you can always open end the roll, so that 175 is not as out of reach as it might necessarily appear. If you have 100 skill bonus, which is, now, as far as I could tell, not quite within reach of starting characters, you'd have trouble getting skill bonus quite that high, but you could get to 70 or so as a starting character, which means if you roll a 90, then you're within a very close margin of outstanding success, and if you open it, you almost certainly got it. So difficulty classes. There's what's called the save roll, which I will, if I end up running this, will almost certainly end up calling these resistance rolls, which is what Rollmaster calls them. That is essentially what they are, and there are toughness save rolls and willpower save rolls. There's no dex or quick swiftness in this game, save rolls. And you write this down on the character sheet, and it goes up as your level goes up. I thought level was capped at 10, but defender level, like monster levels, can go higher than 10. So, and attack levels can definitely go higher than that as well. Okay, so magic. Magic works exactly like the skills, and there are what are called spell lores, which are little clusters of related skills, most of which are in the back of the book. Essentially, as you learn a spell lore as a skill, and then every rank in the spell lore is a new spell level from that spell lore. We won't get into this in detail in this video, but if we look at the spell lores, I'll show you how that works. When we'll get to that when the book gets to it. There's a nice section on movement and traveling. This is somewhat inspired by the One Ring RPG, actually, I would say. Traveling is a big feature in a lot of the inspirational material. There's a little section on chases, on encounters and evasion. Some stuff on environmental damage like drowning and extreme heat and cold. Here's how to forage. We have encounter tables, not all of which are monsters. Some of these are environmental effects, which is really pretty cool. And you have a bunch of these for different terrain types. Highly recommend, even if you end up having the physical book, I highly recommend having a PDF of this, by the way, so that you can print these individual pages out without having to bend the book's spine to try and photocopy them. Campsites and safe havens. So safe havens is another neat thing. So a safe haven is basically a place where you can rest for a long period of time, right? Think of Rivendell, for example. And you have to find a safe haven, but how you find it is kind of a impromptu thing where it's like you might say, oh, what about the Citadel of blah, 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 can we find a safe haven there? And sure, you might be able to make your way there, and then you can do your rest and your learning and your character advancement. That's where those things happen. And there are special activities that I just mentioned, among other things, that you can partake in a safe haven. You can also randomly generate this. So if we, who's an Nth? The master is a Manish clan chief. The defense is enthralling winds. The place might be a spirit wood, and the special feature might be an enchanted vessel, like a bowl or a fountain or something like that. So that's actually pretty cool. Merriment is one of the things that can be found in a safe haven. That's why Bilbo retired there, actually. Wealth. In this system, you do not have a penny counting, which is something that a lot of people actually like, and I kind of tend to like as well. Against the Darkmaster uses a wealth level system, whereby you can afford it if its cost is your wealth level or lower. And if it's more than your wealth level, then you can buy it, but then your wealth level goes down. Or something similar. Equipment, there's a big thing of equipment. And you can see the availability is how that works. Here's a big description of armor and shields. We're going to blow through the combat stuff because I'm going to briefly explain it, and everything I say about combat also applies to Rolemaster and Merc. Here's the combat system. You have a bonus to your attack skill that you roll percentile, add that bonus, maybe you add or subtract some additional modifiers, and then you look up that result on a table. That's the combat system. Very simple. You may score a critical hit, in which case you will roll another die on the critical hit table. The idea that it's called a critical hit might imply that it is a rare result. It is not a rare result. It's not an every time thing. You won't always get a critical, but a lot of times you'll get a critical. It's not rare to get criticals. There's a lot of little details here, although it's not a complicated combat system. And then there's fumbles. If you roll low enough, you get a fumble. And you roll on the fumble table where you might shoot yourself in the foot, for example, or break your weapon or anything like that. You do have a set of conditions, which is kind of common in these types of RPGs nowadays. Various different combat options that you can do, which is nice. The nice little double page illustration there with an oversized sword. There's what's called martial moves too, which is kind of like the old martial arts system in Rolemaster. Health and healing section on that. Death and dismemberment. You can lose limbs in the critical system. Stuff for poisons and diseases, for healing herbs, which is a big thing in Rolemaster. This is an interesting system in that you actually kind of build the system out as you play instead of having a giant list in the book of healing herbs, which I kind of like, actually. It will give your campaign its own unique feel. Tales of Legend. Preparing the game. So blowing through this. This is the campaign prep section, and in this section somewhere is the guidelines for how to create and animate your own Darkmaster. That's this section here, the epithet. So you can roll it, you can come up with this yourself, of course, inspired no doubt by Dio, but you can generate a random epithet where the Darkmaster might be the immortal flame of night, for example, which sounds dopey, but you could totally make it work. So a lot of stuff about the Darkmaster servants, how the Darkmaster can get involved and be involved in your campaign. Here is an example Darkmaster. The Horned King of Anun, the Witch Queen of Despair, and the Blood Lord of War. And here's Dark Sorcery, which is a spell lore intended to be used by foes. Remember that in Against the Darkmaster, the player characters are the brave, plucky heroes. They are, maybe not perfect exemplars of sterling character, but they are the characters that are fighting against the evil forces. So they are not intended to use the evil forces magic. This is the evil forces magic. Not that you couldn't make that work, but that's the intention, and I would want to tread very carefully as a game master on giving player characters access to this type of spell list. Not like it's overpowered as such, but tonally you'd have to be careful with it. Not to say you couldn't do it. And here's Necromancy. That's another one. So we see that there are 10 levels here. They're called weaves, and as you gain ranks in the spell lore, you work your way up. So if you have 5 ranks, you can cast up to level 5, right? Which may or may not equal your own level. If you are lower than that level, it is called overcasting, and there's a penalty to do it, but you have to make die rolls to cast the spells. So, it totally makes sense. All right. And here's the more Game Master material. There is a sort of discussion of war and battle without being an actual mass combat system, I don't think. It's a way to resolve a mass combat with a die roll, basically. So I wouldn't call it a mass combat system, more an addendum to the resolution system to help you deal with that. Campaign options beyond level 10. So this talks about level 10 is the normal cap. You could hack the system so that it's not capped at 10. Rolemaster was not capped at 10, but MERP was. Here's the Sage. That's the other vocation, which I would totally allow as a player character, with the caveat that it's, probably hard to play because you don't have a lot of combat-related skills. But on the other hand, I would say combat is something you might prefer to avoid where you can in this system. I mean, think about the number of fights that occur in Lord of the Rings, right? It's not that many, and it's a lot less than there was in the movies. Rewards, magic items. There's a good discussion of magic items with enough samples to get you started, but you're kind of intended to create your own magic items as the game master of this thing. And then we have a bestiary. It is not the most exhaustive bestiary, and I am always in favor of having the bestiary be in a separate book, but, sometimes they don't know if there's going to be a separate book, so I'd rather have it than not have it. So, examples in the bestiary include the Awakened Tree. You can draw your own conclusions there. The Boggart. There's various types of demons, which include werewolves and vampires, by the way, and the Shadow Flame Demon. So you can figure out the inspiration for that. And having werewolves and vampires be demons of the elder days is also very much in keeping with Tolkien. There are dragons. There's a couple different kinds of dragons, including sea drakes. There's dragon spawn, which are like dragon men, very much in keeping with the dragon dudes from Dragonlance, for example, or the Dragonians of Rolemaster, the Dvergar, the Evil Man. So these are all the way up from, sub-lieutenants of the Darkmaster to just common scrubs like bandits. So these are Evil Man, in this case, is just kind of a blanket category for bad humans. Fellwing, which is very much a fell beast. Fomorians, ghouls, ghosts, various types of undead. Then giants, which I like the picture. Giant eagles. Wonder why those would be useful. Now, I got to tell you that anybody in the U.S. might recognize Giant Eagle as the local supermarket. So bear that in mind. Here's giant spiders, even lesser spiders, great spiders, and mother of spiders. So you can think of spiders of Mirkwood, Shelob, and Ungoliant category. That's how I would categorize that as well. Although Goliath might be higher than level 15 too, considering she scared Morgoth. The Gore Crow, which are like the sort of intelligent crows. Sea monsters, the Krakens, the Murlocs. I am inspired while reading this, just offhand, to combine this with an old Avalon Hill setting called Perilous Lands, which is very inspired by Celtic mythology, actually, without actually using Perilous Lands, just borrowing some of the bestiary entries from it, which did have a lot of neat bestiary entries. Spirits, stone guardians, trolls, undead thralls, unseelie, Vargar, which are sort of giant direwolf type things that are actually inspired. They're evil spirits given physical forms. Wild beasts, wights, wraiths. Okay, and how tough are they? Pretty tough. Okay, so here we have the grimoire. So these are the descriptions of the spell lores, and this is a big chunk of the book because there's a lot of spell lores for the different classes. And the magic using classes will have like native spell lores, and there's 3 or 4 magic using classes that are favored for them. So we're not going to get into, since I've explained in very brief detail how spell lores work. We're not going to look at that. But again, think the spell list from Rolemaster or the spell, I was about to say spell phyla from Swords and Glory, but nobody's going to find that to be a familiar reference. If you're familiar with the GURP system, there are the colleges, or Dragon Quest had colleges as well. So they're thematically related groups of spells ranked in levels. And then we have Shadows of the Northern Woods. So this one I'm going to blast through because I don't want to spoil it. This is like part 1 of a 3-part adventure that I think you can get the rest of either on Drive-Thru RPG or through the Open-Ended Games website. And there's a whole list of sample characters as well, including Athelstane the Black, Mydoc the Cunning. The sample stuff is all very Celtic inspired. And I think there's 6 of these sample characters. And then in the back, you have this giant appendix, which is basically all of the tables. And a bunch of other stuff too. Now, what of this stuff is stuff that because it's a table heavy game, right? It's still a table heavy game. If you're scared of tables, you're probably going to be scared of this game. But you don't use all of these tables. Some of them are just lists too, right? So here's the lists of spell lores, for example, and all the lists. That's a big chunk of this, in fact. Here's example characters. So Star Elven Noble Champion, NPCs at different levels. Here's what their skills would be. So a lot of this is like the first, 15 pages or so are the tables you'd use in actually running the game. Here are your attack tables. That's, I think, all the attack tables. And then you have your critical tables. That's pretty much all the critical tables. And then you don't really need the save rolls table. You might as the game master, but as a player, you don't need it. And then maybe you need this magic table, and there's probably a skill resolution table until you memorize what the thresholds are. And then everything else is just like tables of weapons and stuff like that. So all that stuff's back here. All the random tables are back here in the back. So let's take a brief look at the Game Master Pack stuff. I don't know what this is called, if it's called the Game Master Pack, but there's a screen and a book. Now, the book is pretty much that same section from the back that we just looked at. And then the screen is a pretty standard Game Master screen from the 90s. And here's why I say that. It's got sort of a nice satin finish, which I like. It's got the nice cover art, which I like. It's got some tables and stuff in it, but it's not on that super heavy duty hardcover stock that we typically see Game Master screens on now. It's on more of a card material. It does have all of the attack tables on the inside of the screen, and they're color coded too, which is nice. And these different colors correspond to different critical thresholds on the critical table. If and when we get to a combat video on this system, please let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see that. Then we will talk about the details of that. So it does feel, it's thin, and I think that's unfortunate, but, we also have this huge book too. And you can see it's kind of tilting now, so I don't know. But the spine didn't blow up when I was flipping through it. So I do believe it to be, and I'll try and take it apart and investigate this off camera, but it does look like it's a sewn book. I am actually pretty excited about Against the Darkmaster. Against the Darkmaster makes me want to run a fantasy RPG again, and maybe we'll see that. If you'd be interested in that, please also mention that in the comments below. In the meantime, as I mentioned, let's wrap this up because the video has been super long. In the meantime, I plan to do additional video content on Against the Darkmaster, and now that I have the physical book to do it, I can thank you, Open-Ended Games. I can actually get involved in the process of that. Anything you want to see about this, please mention it in the comments below. If you have liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon to get notified when new content comes out. I would very much appreciate if you would like to support Ardwulf's Lair. If so, please click on the merch store or Patreon links in the video description. Until next time, thank you for watching and happy gaming.